Let's journey back to early 20th century Sicily, where Benito Mussolini, one of the most infamous dictators in history, waged a battle against an unexpected enemy, the Mafia. Known for its criminal empire and notorious code of silence, the Mafia had embedded itself deeply within Sicilian society. Yet Mussolini, obsessed with totalitarian control, couldn't tolerate any rival forces, including the Mafia's criminal influence. You might be surprised, but for a short time, Mussolini's aggressive methods did have an effect on the Mafia. However, whether this was a victory or just a temporary suppression is debatable. Let's explore how this clash of two powers unfolded, starting with the Mafia's rise to prominence and how Mussolini's regime attempted to crush it. The birth of the Mafia. The Mafia didn't start out as the vast international criminal network we think of today. In fact, its origins can be traced back to feudal times in 19th century Sicily. After Italy's unification, law enforcement was almost non-existent on the island, and local elites were left to fend for themselves against rampant banditry. To protect their land, the wealthy hired mercenaries, armed groups known as companies at arms, to guard their properties. These mercenaries were often closely linked to the very criminals they were supposed to be hunting down, leading to a complex relationship of betrayal and opportunism. As these mercenaries gained more power, they evolved into local protection rackets. They began squeezing both landowners and peasants for money, effectively running their own parallel system of authority. By the late 19th century, the term mafia had entered the Sicilian vocabulary, symbolizing the swagger and bravado of this rising criminal class. The mafia's influence soon extended to politics, as they began to bully and bribe their way into government positions, further cementing their control over Sicilian society. Mussolini's rise and the challenge of the mafia fast forward to 1922, when Mussolini seized control of Italy, intent on consolidating his power. One of his first challenges was the mafia's entrenched influence in Sicily. The mafia, with its code of silence or omerta and its own form of governance, stood as a direct threat to Mussolini's vision of a fully centralized and authoritarian state. In 1924, Mussolini made a high-profile visit to Sicily, where he planned to assert his dominance. However, things didn't go as planned. Don Francesco Cuccia, a mafia boss who also served as the local mayor, met Mussolini and reportedly made a sarcastic offer. "You don't need these soldiers here. You're under my protection." This comment enraged Mussolini. He was the dictator, the one in control, and the idea that the mafia might think it could offer him protection was an insult he wouldn't tolerate. Determined to make an example of the mafia, Mussolini turned to Cesare Mori, a no-nonsense law enforcement officer who had already made a name for himself fighting mafia members. Mori was given extraordinary powers to combat organized crime in Sicily. In effect, Mussolini handed Mori a blank check, allowing him to bypass laws and standard procedures to deal with the mafia as ruthlessly as possible. Mori's siege of the mafia. In 1926, Mori's most infamous operation began in the hilltop town of Ganghi. Under Mussolini's orders, Mori laid siege to the town, cutting off communication lines and surrounding it with armored vehicles. His forces went house to house, arresting anyone suspected of mafia connections. Wives and children were held hostage, cattle were slaughtered in the streets, and men were forced to surrender or face brutal consequences. In some cases, those who refused were tortured using the rather grim method of being forced to drink castor oil or eat live frogs. After 10 days of intense pressure, Mori entered the town to a staged welcome, complete with bands, banners and cheers. In total, the operation resulted in the arrest of over 100 suspected mafia members. This event was heralded as a triumph, and Mori continued his campaign across Sicily with similarly brutal tactics. Over the next few years, he arrested more than 11,000 people, though many of them were likely innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of Mussolini's war against the mafia. The temporary defeat of the Mafia. At first glance, Mussolini's crackdown seemed to be a success. Mafia-related crimes vanished from the news, and the organization was severely weakened. Mori's harsh methods had created an atmosphere of fear and terror, pushing the Mafia underground. But while the fascist regime celebrated this victory, the reality was far more complex. For one thing, Mori's campaign didn't address the root causes that had allowed the Mafia to thrive in the first place. Sicily remained a region plagued by poverty, corruption, and weak government oversight. The Mafia had emerged as a response to these conditions, and unless those deeper societal problems were solved, organized crime would inevitably return. Moreover, many high-ranking Mafia members were never caught. Instead, they fled to other countries, particularly the United States. There, they regrouped and established strong criminal networks, helping to lay the foundation for the international Mafia we know today. Some even argue that Mussolini's crackdown contributed to the Mafia's global expansion by forcing them to relocate and reorganize abroad. The Mafia's return. After Mussolini. Mussolini's regime fell at the end of World War II, and with it, so did the fascist control over Sicily. Once the dust settled, the Mafia, which had been weakened but never destroyed, re-emerged stronger than ever. In fact, many Sicilians, disillusioned by the brutal fascist rule, began to see the Mafia as a lesser evil, or even as protectors against state oppression. As American troops moved through Italy during the war, they even relied on local Mafia figures to help restore order in Sicily. Ironically, the same organization Mussolini had fought so hard to crush was now being used by the Allies to help stabilize the island. With the fall of the fascist government, the Mafia wasted no time in reclaiming its position of power. Once again, it became a dominant force in Sicily, now with international connections, particularly in the United States, where the Mafia had established a significant presence. The legacy of Mussolini's war on the Mafia. So, did Mussolini really defeat the Mafia? In the short term, his regime undoubtedly weakened the organization, forcing it underground and disrupting its operations. But in the long term, Mussolini's heavy-handed tactics failed to solve the deeper issues that allowed the Mafia to flourish. Rather than eradicating the Mafia, Mussolini's campaign merely displaced it, giving it the opportunity to adapt, regroup, and expand beyond Italy. In the end, Mussolini's efforts were little more than a temporary interruption in the Mafia's long history of power and influence. Today, the Mafia remains a powerful force, both in Sicily and across the globe, a testament to the fact that deep-rooted societal issues cannot be solved through brute force alone.